Welcome everyone to another episode of Vinny Makes the Hall of Fame Case for ... And you can't do a show called Vinny Makes the Hall of Fame Case for without Vinny. Vinny, how
Yeah,
you
doing good. Yourself?
doing? Doing good. Thanks for asking. Today we've got we're going down to Kansas City and Kansas City. Here I come. And the 80s are a very interesting time for the Chiefs because there is a lot of good players that came out of there, but we don't really talk about enough. Neil Smith, certainly being the biggest one in my eyes, but you've got a really good one here today. And I think for people your age, although you're the exception, that's why you're America's favorite sports historian. But most people think of Kansas City as this big juggernaut. That was not the case in the 80s, where they were, I don't want to say the redheaded stepchild of the AFC, but they weren't getting a whole lot of love. They didn't do a whole lot, but there was a lot of great players there.
Because when you look at the AFC during the time of the Kansas City Chiefs, now don't forget the Kansas City Chiefs were the most dominant team in the early AFL days, followed
Right.
by the Bills and the Oilers. But when you get into the NFL era, like after their dynasty in the
Mhm.
AFL, in that same division, the Raiders were getting bigger. The Seahawks were soon added, and also the Broncos were getting their dominance, and also the Chargers were getting dominance. So the
Mhm.
Chiefs, I mean, even though the Seahawks weren't super great, they were still competitive, and the Chiefs were just sort of there. But they had some really dominant players, like you mentioned, Neil Smith. But Neil
Right.
Smith also came in the late '80s. Same with Hall of Famer Derek Thomas.
Mhm.
When you look at someone that played majority from the 1980s, in my personal opinion, you can't talk about that without mentioning Darren Cherry,
Okay.
who was on the NFL's 80th, who was on the NFL's 80s All-Decade team. He was also someone who was a six-time Pro Bowler, all consecutively, and he's also a five-time All-Pro from the Associated Press.
Before we go into more of that, you said this one was a request.
Yes, like I said, this entire month that I'm doing this is March 18th, the day that I'm recording this. This is the month of requests. And I've said that from to you, Kirk, that from when you're here until you move to Seattle, I'm having it open for all requests.
Mhm.
And this one is from a request from someone I've known for a decade at this point. That is Mr. Jeff Schlegel, the Schleg Daddy, as they
Oh,
call him. He's someone
okay.
I've known for a very long time. Granted, he and I can sort of butt heads with our
Oh, a little
uh,
bit.
a little bit, but at the same time, he respects me, I respect him, and he said, and I said to him, hey, I know you say your favorite player is Wilbur Marshall. Would you want me to do a case? And then he said, honestly, Vin, as much as I would want him, I would actually be more interested to hear what your case would be on one of those DBs and safeties of the 80s and 90s. I was thinking like a Darren Cherry, and I said, perfect, I'll do Darren Cherry. He says,
Okay.
very nice in the
Yeah.
Borat voice.
Yeah. Well, he's got an interesting story too. Undrafted out of Rutgers, and kind of begged his way to stay on the team. Said, I can do this. I can punt. Never did punt, but he could have, I guess.
Oh yeah, like he is one of the greatest undrafted players in NFL history. Definitely one of, if not the best, from the 1981. And if you look at 1981, in that 1981 NFL draft, the same year that he was drafted, you also had another great player that was undrafted. That was Jay Hilgenberg and Everson Walls and Darren Cherry.
Hmm.
And of course, you got the Hall of Famer and Sam Hill. So there was a lot of really quality, and also Joe Jacoby. That's another one. So that's a lot of really dominant undrafted players. And look at that 1981. For some reason, 1981 was stock full of them because you also had Mike Singletary Singletary, Lawrence Taylor, Ricky Jackson, Russ Grimm, Kenny Easley, and like as I said, Sam Mills, all came in that same year in 1981. So whatever it was, I don't know what was in the water at that time, but 1981 was when a lot of great professional football players came into the NFL or just pro
Mhm.
football as a whole. And Darren Cherry just happened to be another one of them.
Yeah,
But unlike those other
50
guys,
interception, 50 interceptions, not bad considering really in his first 2 years he didn't play much.
not only that, he also has the record for most passes intercepted in a single game with 4.
Oh, okay. Who do you do that against?
Um, forgot who it was against, but I
Sorry, didn't mean to
do
put you on
believe
the
it was
spot
one of
there.
his first team All Pro seasons, if I
Okay.
recall.
So with Cherry, it's a sort of an interesting thing. Correct me if I'm wrong. I know he was never a finalist. Did he even reach the semis, or we're not even tracking it then? I don't think.
No, no. Instead, what's happened is, and I hate saying it like this because the Hall of Fame for a long time and still they seem to think that once you get one person in for one position, then you're off limits for a while. Like, for instance, I was so very happy that Ken Riley made it, but the downside is that it seems like we have to wait a while for Lamar Parrish.
Hmm.
Also, not only this, in the Chiefs case, Albert Lewis, his teammates, has gotten the attention ahead of him and was a finalist in his final year as a modern, also was one of the 12 as a senior most recently. And Darren Cherry's sort of been on the back burner when you could argue Darren Cherry, especially as a defensive back, was an all-around better player than Lewis. Granted, Lewis was also better in terms of special teams compared to Cherry, but Cherry, in terms of a defensive back, was definitely better, at least in my opinion.
Okay, and so why would you say that? I mean,
I,
we do have the one stat, obviously, of 50 interceptions, but I mean, like we see a lot of players get in now because it was also a sort of a different way of thinking. I mean, right now, if somebody's super good as a defensive back, you're not throwing to him at all. So it's
oh yeah.
almost next to impossible for any. Well, I don't say next to impossible, but I don't know if we're ever going to see anybody with 50 interceptions again.
You don't know, but at the same time, he's someone that was a player of the week 3 times in 80, one in 85, 86, and 87. Also, I mentioned all decade team
Right.
on Pro Football Reference. He's on their first team 1980s all decade team,
Hmm.
shared with Ronnie Lott. That's right. Ronnie Lott and Darren Cherry are the two first team all decade 1980s players for PFR's all decade team. And yeah, when you're compared to Ronnie Lott and you are also the first
Right.
team safety, that says a lot. Now, granted, to be fair, Lott was also listed as a corner as well as a safety,
Hmm.
unlike Cherry, who's just listed as a safety. But
Right.
nevertheless, he and Ronnie Lott were the two first team all decade safeties for PFR. So that's pretty big.
Okay. So
Not only that, he is someone who, like I said, he had 5 seasons top 10 in terms of interception finishes. He's also someone that just in general was an overall dominant safety in the 1980s. And, we got the first teams. Then you have the second team NFL 1980s all decade teams. Cherry has the most votes of the NFL 80s all decade team that's not in as a safety. Cromwell and Brown are tied with 4, but Cherry has 5 votes.
do you think it's because of the team he played for at the time why he gets like no attention? I mean, like same question, I guess, for Neil Smith. You can tell I'm sort of bigger on him, but
Well, Smith is stranger to me considering he has the 2 Super Bowls and well, he was also part of that second team. And granted, there's some people that don't look too high on second team. I'm someone of the opinion that I think there should also be a third team for all
Mhm.
decades, just like how I think there should be third teams for all pros. Nevertheless, he's on that second team. Yes, I think when you look at the 80s Kansas City Chiefs, like you look at, I mentioned the AFC West, that was dominated by what? The Broncos. And also you had the entry point, you had the Chargers and the Raiders, but it was mostly the Broncos show and the Seahawks were, there. I mean, yeah, you had your rivalry with
Right.
but even then I asked other people like, hey, what was the Seahawks biggest rival in the West? Said, oh, they were there. It's same. But the 80s of the Chiefs, they only made the playoffs one time, And that was when they were a wild card team in 86, and they lost in the first round to the Jets 35-15.
Mhm. Yeah.
That plays a big reason as to why. Only but then in the 90s, that was the last 2 years of his career. There was the Dolphins, where they lost in the first round, and then in '91, he finally won his first and only playoff game with the Chiefs against the division rival Raiders before losing to the Bills the following week. So for Darren Cherry, he didn't have much playoff success as a corner, as not a corner safety, but
Mhm.
it was not his fault. He was a really dominant player in the 1980s, for sure. He was not as good in 89, 90, 91, but at the same time, there's no question that he was someone who was looked at as the focal point of that defense for the 1980s decade.
Yeah, and certainly for a long time. It doesn't. I mean, we've seen this a lot before. Certain players get buried because of the teams they're on, and then ironically enough, I mean, here we talk about the Chiefs now. Some people might get elevated. Uh,
Yeah, hopefully. Like, granted, Johnny Robinson was finally put in the Hall of Fame a couple years ago. Of course, Tony Gonzalez recently made it. Like I said, Albert Lewis has gotten traction. Otis Taylor's gotten traction. I think there's other people like there, like Ed Buttle and EJ Hall, Fred Urbanos. You also have Lloyd Wells, Jack Seven. There's a lot of Chiefs I can think of. And Darren Cherry, when it looks to the 1980s, he's the one I look to even higher than that of Albert Lewis. And again, this is nothing against Albert Lewis. I think Albert Lewis is also really deserving. However, when it comes to, like I said, when it comes to Darren Cherry, I look him higher as an overall defensive back. Like, even when you look at, the Hall of Fame monitor, Darren Cherry is 63.08, whereas Albert Lewis is 51. So he's ranked higher in terms of that.
mhm. Okay. All right.
So
Interesting.
I hope he gets more. But there's another thing I want to mention with Derrick
Yeah,
Cherry too, that
please.
it wouldn't get mentioned in terms of the player unless Canton finally does the contributor way that basketball does. But I would still throw it in here. Did you know he was also the first ever minority owner
I
in
learned that
NFL history?
today. I learned that today. I didn't know that until I was doing a bit of research. Yeah.
Yep.
So like with the Jacksonville Jaguars, like as part of a group.
Yes, he
Yeah.
was he was part of the group that created the Jaguars. He was not one of the major ones. He was a more minor person, but he's the
Mhm.
first ever non-white owner of an NFL team. Granted, it was a small percentage, but at the same time, those small things really go a long way.
Mhm.
So you can make a serious statement that this man was an actual absolute pioneer. And not only that, he's also the managing partner with a local distributor for Anheuser-Busch called United Beverage in Kansas City. So this is a man who has donated a lot to people. Again, it's also been named the Man of the Year Award in 1988, doing with, United Negro College Funds, Special Olympics, mustard fee. So he's a definite Hall of Fame human being, and he's also someone that was a true trailblazer for minority ownership for minorities. I mean, of course, not minority in terms of
No, no, no,
minor
100%. Yeah,
it's kind
interesting.
of a yeah. Not only that, I should mention talking about the AFC stuff. He didn't start a game until the year that he was named an All Pro and a Pro Bowler. So
Third
in
season, yeah.
81 and 82, he didn't start any games. But in 83, started all the games, was named a Pro Bowler and an All Pro. And for his entire career, 5-time first team All AFC in the 1980s.
Mm.
So, yeah, I would say no question in my mind. When I look at Darren Cherry, I look at the best corner throughout the entire. Not, why do I keep saying corner? The best safety throughout the entire AFC of the 1980s, outside of his former rival and Kenny Easley, who made it because of Bob Copain, and I thank him a lot for that. Power to the people, as I say. But I think Darren Cherry deserves to be there, and I'm pretty sure Kenny Easley would agree with that also.
I'm sure he would. All right, this has been really interesting. Also, too, it's really nice to talk about a player who his post his post playing career has probably exceeded it, and not necessarily through football, which is really awesome to see because sadly we see so many athletes sort of like fall by the wayside.
Yeah, like I said, just I know that I'm not going to focus on character too much, but this is someone who truly was ahead of his time in many attributes, especially as being a quality role model for other people. And with that entailed, I don't see why he isn't in Canton yet. Forget just the character aspect, like mentioning all pros and all decades, and then also his story of getting there despite being undrafted. If that's not Hall of Fame worthy, I don't know what is.
Okay. Well, Vinny, as always, this has been a lot of fun. And we close the same way we always do. Wherever you are, wherever you may be, make it a rocking day because it never comes again. Take care, everyone.